having to do with India, Russia, and China. With India, currently the US is building high-tech and defense partnerships. But new tariffs and trade dispute risk pushing New Delhi too far. With Russia, Washington is doubling down on sanctions and military support for Ukraine, echoing Brzezinski warnings about Moscow's drive to reclaim its empire. And with China, the US is restricting advanced technology and tightening Indo-Pacific alliances, a strategy right out of his book, right out of Brzezinski playbook to prevent one power from dominating Eurasia. And I've told you many times before that the idea is that he is in the process, right, of understanding what's going on. And it's very key. Okay. Make sure that there is the key questions. Are today's policies following his vision or making the very mistakes he warned against, like driving in Russia and China closer together? Now, that is something that I've been saying for quite some time. You know, what is the U.S. up to? What are they doing? That doesn't make any sense. Hold on. This policy is not a new policy. This is a very historical driven policy by the U.S. The very idea, is to keep China, Russia, and India apart from each other. And basically, we're talking about Eurasia. Don't forget, these three countries are next to each other. They have common borders. And what Brzezinski said all along was we need to make sure the interest of the U.S. is preserved by keeping these three folks, these three large countries, apart from each other. That is what's happening. And you need to understand, because obviously nobody wants a war. But also, more importantly, you need to understand what it is that what the U.S. is doing. And what it's doing is basically applying the Brzezinski methods. So first of all, who was this guy? Who was Zbigniew Brzezinski? Who was he? And why do you care? Well, first of all, you need to understand that Brzezinski was born in Warsaw in 1928. He immigrated after World War II and became a U.S. citizen. He served as a national security advisor, the national security advisor to President Carter from 1977 to 1981. Whoa! That was such a long time ago. Why do we care? You need to care. You need to understand. You need to know. And you need to analyze, because essentially the U.S. is still very much using the same methods. And what did he believe? Right? What is... Here he goes. What did Brzezinski believe? Well, first of all, he was an anti-communist. He viewed the Soviet Union as the greatest threat to U.S. interests. He advocated for human rights, as a foreign policy tool against authoritarian regimes, China and Russia. And he championed the U.S.-China normalization to balance Soviet power. He's a very important person, and you should know him, because he basically, besides being the National Security Advisor, he also helped mediate the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel in 1978. That was a major undertaking and a major accomplishment by the Carter administration at that time. He supported arming Afghan fighters after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And I'm not going to go, at least not now, into the impact that this invasion of Russia, of Afghanistan, and the fact that bin Laden came out of this war. But we'll deal with this at a later time. But basically, and he wrote a major book which you should read. I want you to read. I want my subscribers and my members to understand and read what's going on. And basically, he wrote about the Grand Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives in 1997, where basically he described Eurasia as a central arena of global power. That's where everything is happening. You have to understand that the U.S. is, all the way there, right? Probably not the best place to be right now, because we have an ocean separating the U.S. from these countries, which is good and safe, but at the same time, it keeps you away physically from these countries. And if you don't know what they're doing, they're going to do what they're going to do. And that could be a potential issue for the U.S. So why is he still relevant today? Well, even though he died in 2017, Brzezinski's ideas echo strongly in the current debates. So let's talk about Russia and Eastern Europe. His warnings about Russia's attempts to dominate his neighbors, sounds familiar? Feel prescient about the invasion of Ukraine. He believed an independent Western-aligned Ukraine was essential. Ukraine, yes, at that time, was essential to prevent Moscow from reasserting imperial influence. Now, I need to, and I'll talk about this, but there's been some intercation recently with Russia, right? First, they flew some drone recently over Poland. That's so far away. I mean, what do I care? Well, trust me, you care. And recently, Russian jet fighters flew over Estonia, a NATO country. Whoa, that's back to back. What is going on there? Right? So basically, 1, Russia and Eastern Europe. 2, China rise. He called to engage China as a counterweight to Russia. And it has evolved into today's question: how does the U.S. balance competition and cooperation with Beijing? Right? There is a need, and right now the U.S. is engaged engaged in trade negotiation with China, and is having issues closing that deal. And number 3, the Middle East. Camp David Accords remain the cornerstone of the U.S., Egypt, and Israel relations. He viewed that the U.S. must prevent any single power from dominating the Persian Gulf, and it continues to shape policy toward Iran and the Gulf state. Look what Israel is doing right now in the Middle East. Is Israel a loose cannon? I mean, you've seen what they've done with Iran. They started this. I mean, I'm sure they have good reason for doing it. And again, there's no good guys and bad guys in this type of situation. What you have interests. And in the Middle East, his view was that you got to make sure no one gets ahead of anyone else in this region. And Israel right now is pushing quite strongly. I mean, Israel recently attacked, Qatar, not directly the country, because they were going after Hamas, the Hamas power that was kind of in Qatar, which is supposed to be the Switzerland of the Middle East, but they actually went in there. Interballistic missiles went up in the air, in space, so that they would not go through the Qatar airspace, and then from space just right on top of the building. They didn't kill the guy that they wanted to kill, but they did do it, and that shook the entire Middle East. The U.S. really didn't say anything. They said, yeah, it's good to go Hamas. I'm pretty upset of what Israel did, but they were kind of justified. So if you believe in Brzezinski, then the U.S. needs to take a hold of Israel to pull them back a little bit, because this is unsettling a lot of the powers. And I will do a live very soon, because you may or may not be aware that because of this, Pakistan is getting very close, and has been gotten very close to the Arab states, Saudi Arabia in particular. And they've been close for quite some time, quite frankly, but this is getting them to be even closer. Because if you can't rein into Israel, then who's next? The grand strategy is Eurasian chessboard idea still frames U.S. policy discussion. It keeps any rival from are uniting Europe and Asia against America. You know, the idea is really to keep all of these countries away from each other, separate, not united. During the time of the tariffs, remember that Europe actually tried to get close to China by visiting China ahead of that famous 15% deal that they got on the tariffs. That was important because they wanted to get. We don't want that. Now, obviously, you may or may not realize, but at some point, China kind of got in to the discussion with Europe. The thing is, the Europe getting close to China is a bit difficult right now because obviously Europe does not agree with what China is doing with Russia against Ukraine. So it's tough to square that circle, if you know what I mean. It's a little bit more difficult. But the point is that they tried to get. Then the president went to met with Russia, met with Putin, and then eventually the European came to the U.S. and sat in front of the teacher's desk, president's desk, all the European powers, and that was good because you want that. You want them here. You don't want them there. You don't want them in China either. You don't want China to be close to Russia. You don't want Russia to be close to India. Definitely don't want India to be close to China because these countries have been fighting with each other. Okay. China had a big war with India. Only now are they starting to get together. So you need to realize that what's going on today has anchors from the past. And you need to realize that at the end of the day, the idea is to keep all these countries apart. Okay? So that's a big, big topic. In short, Brzezinski relevance today lies in how his framework for Russia, China, Eurasia, and the Middle East still define the strategic dilemmas the U.S. faces. This is not, don't bring it all to the president doing all these things that upsetting a lot of people. No. The U.S. has been doing this forever, with success, without success, but has been trying very hard to keep, and frankly, it's not just the U.S. doing it. They're also doing it to each other and to the U.S. So all these countries are making sure through diplomacy, through tariffs, whatever they need to do to make sure everyone is standing on different footing so they don't get too strong versus the other. It's all about power. It has nothing to do with being a good country, a bad country. No, it's all interest. What is in your interest to keep things going? And that is very important. And it's very important because if you get it wrong, then you're going to be shut out. And if you shut out for too long, then that's when you have a war, right? Because now you need to get in the middle. You need to break that situation. So, for example, very recently, right, you had the Russian military flights. This is serious. That happened a couple of days ago. You had some Russian military flights over Estonia's airspace and frequent airspace violation near the Baltics more generally. And that connects very directly with Brzezinski's geopolitical framework. Let me explain. I know this is a bit complicated. It's not everybody's rule book because people are busy with a bunch of other things, and God knows that the media is full of different things, right? But at the end of the day, what I want you to understand is that first, this airspace violations as political messaging, okay? Brzezinski often highlighted how Moscow used intimidation. Remember, he did that 30 years ago. Not just conquest, because everybody's saying, oh, wow, Russia wants to invade. It's not like that. It's more complicated than that. A war will be very simple, quite frankly. You go in and you do your thing. Here, it's a little bit more difficult and a little more strategic to apply. And basically, he's doing that to influence his neighbors. Russian fighter jets basically crossing or skirting Estonian airspace. Estonian is very close to Russia. It's got a border with Russia. Are not simply military maneuvers. They are signals of power projection. Okay? Means to test NATO's resolve and to remind Estonia of its vulnerability. This echoes Brzezinski's belief that Russia would seek to pressure small borders, Estonia. I mean, they don't have airplanes to fight. But basically in ways that probe Western unity without crossing the threshold into outright war. So what is Russia up to? Of course, they said that that's not true. We didn't do this. Our plane did not fly over Estonia. The same way they said that, well, our drones, yes, they flew over Poland, but we didn't mean to. We didn't mean to. It was Ukraine interferences that caused the drone to kind of get lost. Be careful. So there's the NATO Article 5 and the Brzezinski legacy. Brzezinski strongly supported NATO's enlargement to include Estonia, which they are now part, and the other Baltics. His reasoning, only the hard security guarantee of Article 5. Does this sound familiar? The security guarantees? That is exactly what Ukraine wants out of the US and also the European countries, for them to have a buffer between Ukraine and Russia. And Russia said, do not send any English, French, or whatever troops in the middle. I will shoot at them. Okay? So this security guarantee is a big thing to be able to deter Moscow from military intimidation, because that's what they're doing. And unfortunately, as you may or may not realize, even though Russia is doing all these things, not much is really going on. I mean, the thing that the U.S. administration has done very recently is they said that, well, maybe what the Europeans should do before thinking about too much about the security guarantees from the U.S., maybe they should apply 100% tariffs on China and Russia. Right? Let's do that first. Let's get these people apart from each other. Let's get in the middle. You get in the middle first. Not just don't think that the U.S. is going to guarantee. But frankly, the U.S. cannot offer security guarantees by putting troops on the ground, because don't forget, there's also another aspect of the MAGA movement that does not want Trump or the U.S. administration to get the U.S. involved in another war. They didn't like the Iran-Israel situation. They did not like that at all. It's over, fine, but that is not something that MAGA wants, and frankly, I don't think the U.S. wants to get into another war at the end of the day. So, essentially, when Russia jets violate Estonia airspace, NATO scrambles aircraft in response. That's what they did. This ritual of scramble and escort is a living example of the Brzezinski doctrine, deterrence by showing that NATO cannot ignore Russian provocations, however minor they may appear. The only issue now versus then is what the European did, and NATO basically, while they sent a bunch of aircrafts, they sent it after a bunch of drones. Right? I mean, Russia could send 500 drones. The European cannot send 500 aircrafts. So to that end, it was not the most smartest thing to do. But then what can you do? Because you are not ready. You are not ready for Russia. You are not ready for the war, the drone war. Right? I mean, you're not able to protect yourself against 500 drones. Look what's happening to Ukrainians every single day. Right? So what they're doing, they're bringing much closer the Patriot missiles, that the batteries that hopefully, but they're not ready yet. Number 3, what's happening is that Brzezinski won because we're testing the West political will. Let's see how close you get together. Brzezinski warned that Russia would engage in salami tactics, small repeated provocations designed to erode Western resolve. What's amazing is that Brzezinski was in the 70s and the 80s. So nothing is really new in all of this. These are not new techniques, new way of thinking, right? These are things that have been going on forever, and you need to understand. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because what we do here, this is the black swan. Right? What is a black swan? Well, a black swan is an event that no one sees coming, and that could impact the stock market, could impact the war, right? For example, the last one that we had was the COVID. Out of nowhere, this thing came up, and nobody thought. Well, nobody. I would say that few people knew that at some point there would be a problem with COVID-like, symptoms and death, and they knew that the germs could eventually come to the U.S. I mean, that's not just happening in China, but the point is nobody saw it coming. And I want my subscribers and I want my members to be aware of all of the potential black swan out there. And this is one of them. So basically, what Russia is doing is testing political will as per the Brzezinski template. He warned that Russia will engage in those techniques. A single airspace violation, for example, is not an act of war. Just because you're flying over, I don't want to fight. I made a mistake. They made a mistake. They forced me into it. There was a problem, whatever. Nothing to do with me. But repeated incidents force NATO countries to constantly respond, risking fatigue or normalization of the provocations. Right? If you do it once, if you do it twice, but he was sporting, and at the end of the day, the Eurasian balance of power in the Grand Chessboard, Brzezinski framed Eurasia as a key arena where U.S. power would be contested. The Baltics, though small, were strategic pivots. If NATO failed to defend them from Russian pressure, whether by cyber, energy, or military intimidation, it would erode Western influence on the entire Eurasian balance. Thus, the Russian flights over Estonia can be seen as small but symbolic moves in a larger geopolitical chess match, the very type Brzezinski theorized about. So, in short, the Russian flights over Estonia are a textbook example of Brzezinski insight. Moscow using military pressure to test NATO, challenge Western credibility, and remind small neighbors of their vulnerability. The ongoing air policing mission in the Baltics are themselves a direct product of Brzezinski's push for NATO enlargement, meant to answer exactly this kind of intimidation. So, why do you care? Why would you care about someone that died several years ago and that was active many, 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 many years ago? Because the countries have not moved, obviously. And therefore, what has changed is the people in power. What has changed is the weapons used. What has changed is the economic reality. And of course, the U.S. of the 70s is not the U.S. of the 2025s. Right? It's not the same anymore. The U.S. has been losing quite a bit of its ability to industrialize itself, to produce its own weapons. Yes. I mean, how do you think you make those jet fighters? How do you think you make the missiles? You need rare earth minerals. And when I first heard the president talking about, well, rare earth minerals, we need the rare earth minerals from Ukraine. First of all, it's not rare earth. It's not rare. Those things are not rare, right? They're basically, what they're there for is basically very dirty. It's very dirty way of digging for these kind of minerals. And what Brzezinski is saying, or was saying, is that you need to be engaged. You have to be engaged. So when you hear the U.S. Telling India 50% tariffs, of course you say, well, come on, India is a friend. What are you doing this to India? After all, they are U.S. friends, right? It's the friend of the U.S. Modi came to the U.S. But what you don't realize is the 50% really have nothing to do really with Ukraine. The 50% in this particular case has everything to do from keeping India away from China. It's not working. Well, first of all, because India said, fine, but I'm still going to meet with China. And in fact, this has little to do with the tariffs because started at the end of 2024, India had started increasing its relationship with China at the end of 2024 by basically saying that we would not be fighting over the border anymore. Because they had war literally because China is literally bordering India. And they said, we can't keep fighting anymore. And then, not only that, then in January of 2025, way before the tariffs, India and China started regular flights between both countries. That was the first time in a long time where they never flew. You could not fly from Delhi into Beijing. You couldn't do it. But in January they did. And then January, February, March, April, they started to visit each other. They started to allow a business to go back and forth. China started helping India. Right? So you're sitting in the U.S. and you're seeing this happen. I got to stop it. Now, of course, at the same time, the U.S. has its own tariffs policy, and they said maybe this is what we need. We need something strong and immediate. Now that's going to take 5-10 years to get in the middle of that. Now, of course, many could argue whether or not this is the right techniques. Maybe you're a little bit, you're being too obtuse, too fortious, right? You're pushing too hard. You're asking for too much too quickly. Well, I mean, look what happened very recently. China plus Russia plus India met in China. And do you remember the display of power? That was not good. That's a bad sign because that means that you're losing ground. They are getting together. And as per Brzezinski, we got to keep these people apart. It is extremely important. So let's take a look, for example, what's going on with India, right? Is India a strategic partner or a friction point? Recent U.S. policy, 2025 tariffs up to 50% on Indian goods, right? Now, this was tied obviously to the trade disputes over agriculture because the U.S. wanted to get its farmers to sell to India. But India is basically saying, no, that's not going to happen because 40% of the population still lives in the field and lives off the fields. If they have to start to compete with the farmers in Texas, they're going to lose out. And Modi, who relies heavily on that 40% population, will lose its job. So therefore, they say, I can't do it. I could help you here and there, but I'm not going to allow this to happen. And that's why India has 39% tariffs on agricultural goods coming out of, coming into to India. Therefore, essentially, you're closing India to the outside market in terms of agriculture. Right? So dairy, agriculture, Russian oil import, no. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. I'm sorry, I can't do it. Then there was a CHIPS Act cooperation, U.S. incentivizing semiconductors and defense tech partnership, growing military and diplomatic ties in the Indo-Pacific. There's such a thing called the Quad, i.e. U.S., India, Australia, and Japan. They're trying to do a Quad, kind of the BRICS equivalent. That really didn't work out. They were supposed to have a meeting with all four of them, but instead, India went to China. Not a good sign. So the Brzezinski lens, the alignment, Brzezinski argued the U.S. must prevent a single power, China, from dominating Eurasia. Closer U.S.-India ties help balance China. Right? You need to balance it off. And if you're not successful, then the only way to break something is you have to fight it. You don't want to get there. It appears that they're trying to get there, but if you're not successful in keeping them apart, then you will have to break them apart, and that's not good. The risk, of course, tariffs and pressure over the oil in Russia could alienate India. Brzezinski warned that regional power like India value autonomy. Overreach could push them towards non-alignment or even technical cooperation with Russia and China. So you have to make sure that you need to negotiate. Right? You need to negotiate. You don't want to do deals. You want to negotiate. And negotiation means that you need to understand who you are facing with. You need to understand the background, and then you need to understand the history, and you need to understand the strategic importance of these things. It's not about, oh, I thought you were my friend, and now you're not my friend anymore. I don't like you anymore. No, that's a wrong approach because it's not working that way. For Russia, we're talking containment through sanctions. So basically, recent U.S. policies expanding sanction, including secondary sanction on countries that buy Russian oil. So first, the U.S. went to India, say 50%. That's not working. So now the U.S. is going to Europe. It's saying, well, you do 100% against it then. You do something. You got to keep them apart. And obviously, they also have their own concerns because they say, well, hold on, if I'm doing this to China and India, but I'm doing business with them. Well, I mean, you want to do business with me? You want your 15% to hold, then you have to do it. Now, you may view this in the prism of one person deciding unilaterally to basically, tax everyone out of creation. But you need to do something strong. If you don't do the tax, then the next thing you know, you need to do war. And you don't want to do that either. That is not a good idea. So basically, it's Russia, diplomatic plus military aid to Ukraine to blunt the Russian aggression. The idea of meeting with Russia, even though people were saying, well, no, you give them too much opportunity, too much power. Well, you got to get in there somehow. Because obviously, Russia is not stopping. Right, against Ukraine. And the sanction didn't do anything. In fact, the sanction from 2022 under Biden got Russia closer to India and Russia closer to China because they had to sell their oil, and China was more than happy to buy it, and so did India. Did the Biden administration caused them to be closer by basically tariff sanctioning the heck out of Russia? Did the U.S. administration now got them closer because of the tariffs? Maybe they were going to get closer ultimately. And this is why Brzezinski at that time said, be careful. You got to keep them apart because naturally they will converge because they are so close to each other. So you got to get in there in some fashion. So Brzezinski saw Russia attempt to control Eastern Europe as a direct threat to U.S. primacy. Supporting Ukraine and sanctioning Moscow mirrors his warning from the 90s and the 2010s about Russia seeking imperial revival. And don't forget, they were quite successful. He was quite successful. There was the Camp David Accord, right? And also in 1984. USSR collapsed. So they knew what they were doing at that time. The risk, of course, is over-reliance on punitive sanction without a long-term settlement. So basically, the 2022 sanction on Russia, let's meet with the guy, let's talk to him, right? We can't just punish him out of oblivion. Without long-term settlement, strategy may destabilize Europe. Brzezinski favored containment plus integration incentives when possible, which is kind of what the U.S. administration is doing. And unfortunately, and I could talk about this and the stock market as well, and what's going on with the Fed and all that, in a sense that you hear lots of, you say, well, what's going on in the economy? Well, first of all, you don't know what's going on in the economy because the data are not the most accurate. And of course, the information that comes out is extremely biased. So it's very difficult for people to understand, well, what's really going on? Should the Fed be independent? Should we rely on the data? Who should I listen to? And this is where the this channel is extremely important, the Black Swan channel, because it provides a certain perspective, a certain understanding, a certain way to analyze the situation for you to understand what's happening. China, right, is a strategic rival in Eurasia. So what are the recent U.S. policies in that area with China? Well, export controls on semiconductors and AI tech, because U.S. is losing that battle. Defense bill barring Pentagon purchases from Chinese firms. You know, the whole thing with TikTok and the idea of taking over Intel and having Nvidia investing in Intel and trying to broke this up. You have to understand that there's lots of people involved in these discussions. People that I've seen, obviously aware of Brzezinski, analyzing the situation and trying to understand what can we do. And this is not easy, right? Because you've got moving pieces on both sides. But yet something needs to happen, because if you don't do anything, or if you wait too long, that they're going to get together. And they're getting closer and closer and closer. The closer they are together, the more likely you're going to have a war to stop it from happening. This defense bill barring Pentagon purchases from Chinese firms. Strong Indo-Pacific alliances. Japan, Philippines, Australia try to get the Quad thing going together. Continued arms sales and support for Taiwan. Now, it's kind of a lone little island over there. Very close to China, which say basically that belonged to me. So the Brzezinski lens, the alignment, Brzezinski basically emphasized the need to manage China carefully. Engage enough to avoid outright confrontation, but preventing from dominating Asia. Very delicate. The tech restriction and alliance building fit this approach. Again, you have to be very careful with China. And obviously you can't jump in there and be too fortress. You don't want to coerce, 145% tariffs. You need to get their attention, which I think you got it, meaning I'm serious this time. I am serious. The US is serious, but you can't push too hard. The risk, obviously, Brzezinski himself warned against creating a hostile Beijing-Moscow axis. By treating both adversaries the same, current U.S. sanctions may be pushing Russia and China closer together. You have to understand, how very tricky this situation is, right? It's very tricky because you need to do it without appearing that you're doing it and without upsetting anyone too much, because if you push too hard, then they're going to get together. And at some point, either you keep them apart, but they want to get together. They want to get together in a worse way now. So you need to manage China carefully. The risk, of course, is, as he mentioned, the hostile Beijing-Moscow axis is a problem. So Brzezinski would likely approve of U.S. strategic balancing, strengthening the India ties. And in fact, right now, India and the U.S. are talking together, and sanctioning Russia, containing China technologically and militarily. But this is becoming more and more difficult with China, because China, frankly, is a powerhouse of industrialization since the 2000, since they joined the World Trade Organization. They have been building and building and building and becoming extremely powerful in their ability to produce. No one wanted to build or dig for rare earth minerals 20 years ago. Why? It's very dirty. Let the Chinese do it. Well, now guess what? They control 80 to 90%. 80 to 90% of what's going on in terms of rare earth mineral. And that's a problem. But he would warn against alienating potential partners. Do not alienate India and drive Russia and China into a deep Eurasian alliance, which undermines the very balance he called essential to U.S. primacy. Balance is very important. Balance is key. Why should my subscribers and my members care about all of this? Well, yeah, obviously you need to care because the U.S. needs to remain in its primacy. It needs to stay and remain powerful, right? And what's been happening, obviously, is, Russia has been quite antsy lately. China is becoming more and more and more powerful. Their army is pretty strong, and you saw the tanks, and they were out there doing their thing, and it was kind of a bit scary, quite frankly, that the U.S. may not be able to match the Chinese war machine or the Russia war machine. NATO itself, the secretary of NATO himself said that we need to be very concerned about Russia. Russia is a war machine. So war, it's basically a war economy. Everything is going the same way the U.S. were in the 40s. Against Germany. It became, everything went towards the taxes, and everything else went to build weapons. And I have news for you. I don't think that Russia can suddenly say, okay, fine, I'm pulling out. Right? I'm not going to be fighting Ukraine anymore because of this reason or that reason. Because that means then that the next day everybody goes home. It would take at least 1 to 2 years to gently pull away from being such a war economy. Imagine that you're making lots of money building a bunch of weapons, and now tomorrow you're not doing it anymore. You are being a teacher again or a professor, making not much money, right? Doing no more incentives. The economy would collapse in Russia because the change will be too much. So the concern is now Russia is getting more and bolder. And of course, Russia went to China. There was this meeting, and now very recently, you may or may not be realized that China is actually financing bonds in order to finance what's going on in Russia. The economy. Because obviously they need money. They're not going to be able to last that long. So, where does this, where does this go? Where does this end? So if you look at some of the recent U.S. policy towards India, Russia, and China, so India, we imposed, the U.S. imposed high tariffs on many goods in 2025, partly as pressure over India continued, partly over pressure over India's continued oil purchases from Russia. That's not just the only reason they're doing it. Trade and diplomatic tension, the U.S. pressing India to open agriculture and dairy market and reduce oil imports. Now, of course, what India could do, frankly, India could simply start to, let's just get these people out of the fields and into businesses, into industry, because agriculture in India is about 18 to 20% of the GDP, so it's still very significant. Get these people out of the fields and into factories to make stuff for the U.S. or whatever. Because India itself has an issue with China. It's got a huge trade deficit with China, and they don't want that either. Right? So, and of course, in terms of Russia broadening its sanction, the U.S. is considering new legislation right now, the Sanctioning Russian Act of 2025, to impose large sanction and possibly secondary sanction on countries buying Russian energy. The U.S. administration that talked about it, that if you're going to help them out, I'm going to tax you, including China and and India. They've done it with India, but I didn't stop them. Strategic rhetoric and efforts to reduce Russian influence in Europe and Ukraine. In China, export control. The U.S. is denying China access to certain advanced technologies. They're fighting over the NVIDIA business, right? Because NVIDIA is sending chips to China, but they're not sending the best chips. Of course, it didn't help that the trade secretary, U.S. trade secretary, basically said, we're sending them the bad stuff. And now China is saying, we don't want the NVIDIA chips. They're illegal. We don't want to buy them. Especially semiconductors. The US has probably 5 to 7 years before it loses its ability to be a player in the semiconductor business. Semiconductors in the US. It's losing ground. Why do you think the US is taking over Intel? Of course, they will tell you that, well, the government should not really be involved in taking over a U.S. corporation. Of course. But this is a problem. How are you going to prop up Intel? Intel is not doing well at all. In fact, recently, in addition to the U.S. taking a stake in Intel, NVIDIA, very successful U.S. company, taking a stake in Intel as well to prop it up. You guys have got to come back to become the powerhouse of U.S. semiconductors, the world semiconductor like you used to be. That has been lost to to China. What are we going to do, right? You need to do something. So you need to take a look at what the U.S. is doing in the Brzezinski lens, right? The historical lens. This is not new. This is part of history. And it's extremely important for you to realize that. Brzezinski geopolitical thought provides several lenses through which we can view these recent policies. You have to look at Eurasia as a strategic chessboard. He believed that dominion over Eurasia, whether by Russia, China, is central to global power balance. And you saw the premier, the Chinese premier standing in the middle and the other two guys next to him. So that is what you need to worry about. That is what you need to concern yourself about. Because if you don't concern yourself about these things, you will not understand them. And I know social media is fast-pacing, right? You're clicking through the TikTok business very quickly to try to understand, but that is key. It is key for you to understand that the U.S. needs to remain relevant, and to remain relevant, it needs to split those three countries apart. Talk to me. I'll see you tomorrow morning, because I will do another live, and this time it's going to be a live. It's going to be a live on whether or not the Fed should be independent or not.